And years ago, I lived and trained in the Great White North. I'm a Canuck. I lived on the north shore of the Great Lakes, and I absolutely love to train. So, in the wintertime, I wanted to go out and train, and I did. And luckily, I had a mentor that showed me some ways to do that. So tonight, what I'd like to do is share some of the things that I learned then and some of the new things I've learned along the way as I've gone through my training journey. My name is Kevin Cheff, and I'm the retriever coach. I've been helping people train their dogs for years now. I do that through in-person workshops all over the country and in Canada and other countries around the world. And also, I have my Fetch platform out there if you haven't heard about it, but that's where I mentor people like you and people all over the world that are training their retriever. I'm their guide, so to speak. I help them when they have problems. I provide them with the training information that they need. I put on regular webinars. I send them training tips. And whenever they need somebody, they just reach out to me and I help them along the way. So thank you for joining me. Let's get into it. So before we start, what I want you to do is, as we go through tonight, of course, I'm going to be giving you a lot of suggestions about what you can do during the winter months to train. But if you guys have some suggestions, I'd like you to enter those into the chat and share them with us. Help us out. Help your fellow trainers out. Tell them what you're doing, why you're doing it, and maybe we can add it to our training program. So the first question I have that I'd like to discuss is, why would we want to do winter training? Well, number one, we love training and so does our dog. So why not get out there and do it? Number two, we can keep our handling skills sharp. There's no sense sitting on the couch all winter when we can be going out and doing some training that's going to keep us sharp at reading what our dog is thinking and communicating properly and maybe keep our casting skills sharp, amongst other things. So that's a great reason for it. We can polish mechanics where we can with our dogs. Mechanics being line mechanics. How do we behave online? How do we get our dog to move with us and think the things they need to think and see the things they need to see? We can elevate standards. So often, a lot of the reasons why we're failing is simply because our standards are not very good. Our dog standards are not very good, and this is a great time to brush them up. We can take problems that we've had over the year to a drill-like environment. We've got this time, and we've got some resources that will allow us to do some drill work to really focus on those things that have been causing a problem. If we have a dog that's lacking confidence, or maybe we're lacking confidence, this would be a great time to simplify things and elevate our dog's confidence, elevate our own confidence. And we can keep our dogs in shape. I mean, why should our dogs sit on the couch all winter and eat potato chips and get overweight and, muscles get out of tone? And that's just potentially setting us up for a problem come springtime when we get back to training with our dogs being out of shape. So let's keep them in shape. The one thing that I find great about doing this training that we're going to cover tonight is when spring comes around and the water warms up, our dogs are going to be ready to jump back in the water. And that's something that people don't often think about. They just see that the water's warmed up and they just want to jump right back into water work when there really needs to be some land work that's done in order to get our dogs prepared for the water work, mentally prepared for the water work. And the last thing I want to do before we go any further is I want to remind you guys, the winters when we have a lot of downtime, the days are short. This is a great time to study. So pull out your videos, pull out your notes, your log books, pull out your training books and do some reading. Create a habit for yourself. Say, hey, when I have my coffee in the morning, I'm going to dedicate 15 minutes to reading, watching a video, listening to a podcast, whatever resources you have to remind yourself of the things that we often forget. I mean, even I forget about things that I used to do that were really important to keep my dog's skills sharp, standards up, and getting the results that I want. So let's talk about the venues that we can use to go out and train. Of course, we're limited. For those of you that have snow, often the fields are just not accessible. And for those of you that have cold weather, but you have fields, well, you're lucky. But let's talk about those people that don't have fields anymore. What can we use? When I lived up in the Great White North, I looked for parking lots that were available. Sometimes you've got parking lots that are lit up at night that are not used. You could go to an industrial park where they tend to work during the day and there's nothing going on at night. Or maybe during the weekend, there are certain businesses that are closed where parking lots are unused. Around here, some of the parking lots that I think about are the ones around stadiums or sports complexes where they're kept clean, but they're relatively unused a lot of the time unless there's an event going on. Schoolyards are a great place on weekends. Those kids are out there on recess and lunch break and they're chomping down the snow, and schoolyards tend to be packed down quite well. Places where kids and families go sliding, they get on that toboggan or that sled and they go down the hill. Oftentimes those hillsides are well packed down. And I even have fetch members who use indoor riding rings. They approach people who have horses and they're not always using their riding rings, and they find out when they're not in use and ask if they can use them or rent them to do training. So think about those places. And again, if you have any ideas, please put them in the chat for people to help us out. The next thing I want to talk about is prepping yourself. It's not just good enough to go out there and train, just pack up the dog and go. I want you to do a little thinking and planning before you go out in the field. So if you're planning on doing a certain drill or setting something up, some concept up, first thing I want you to do before you go is review your notes or review the guidelines that you've been given by, somebody who supplies that type of training information, and determine what the focus is. You need to know what outcome you want when you do the training you do. If you're just going through the motions of running a drill and you're missing key things that are happening and not addressing these behaviors, perhaps your standards are much lower than they need to be, or the actual outcome that you're trying to achieve, you're just not going to get to it because you're not addressing the things that are happening or reacting in the ways that you need to react. So not only are you looking for what your focus needs to be, but when something happens, how should you react in those situations? So we're going to talk a lot about fundamentals on top of a number of things. We're going to talk about marking and concepts, whether it's blinds or marks. But I want to talk about fundamentals. People love to do advanced work. They love to do the big, sexy stuff. But unfortunately, if we forget the fundamentals, overlook the fundamentals, we don't insist on certain standards when it comes to fundamentals, advanced training is fruitless. You can go out and do all the advanced training you want, but you're not going to reach your goal. Success is virtually impossible without really high fundamental standards. So the first few things I want to cover in terms of the work that you can do this winter are things that address standards. Number one, obedience, noise, line manners. We've got a lot of retrievers out there that are noisy, that don't get to the line in a disciplined fashion like a team player. And once they're on the line, they're bouncing all over the place. They're getting out in front of you. It's hard to get them back to the holding blind if you have a no bird. You can't communicate them to ask them to do what you need them to do because they're simply not willing to work with you as a team player. So what can we do in order to achieve that standard of steadiness, obedience, and quietness? Well, I just had a big conversation with my fetch members about this and some of the things that you can even do in the house. Now, this isn't out in the field, but what can you do in the house to establish the hierarchy that you'd like in your relationship with your dog? You can't be on an equal playing field. You have to establish that you are the alpha in the relationship. That's how you get respect from your dog in this highly stimulating environment of field work where there's guns and birds going off and flyers and duck calls and all that stuff. So in the house, what I want you to do is insist on certain standards. I want you to have structure. I want you to ask your dog to sit quietly while you prepare their food bowl and put it on the ground. And don't let them go to the food bowl until it's time for them to go to it. When somebody comes and knocks on the door, if they're barking and jumping up on the door, they need to be taught to go to a place where they sit calmly and wait until they're invited off of that mat or Cato board or whatever it is, and you've already invited your guest in. Or if you're going into the living room to watch some TV or read a book, show them that there's a place, a designated place where they should go and sit or lay down and hold themselves accountable for maintaining that position while you read for 20 minutes. That doesn't mean they have to stay on the bed or the Cato board all throughout the evening while you're reading a book. But what you're establishing is that you dictate when and how your dog can do things. You are also establishing that you have standards, and if you don't meet my standards, there's potentially going to be consequences. And here's what really matters is that you enforce those standards. You don't allow your dog to try to lower a standard and not get up off your butt, go over and pick up, a short lead or a tab that you've got on the dog, make a correction, and tell them to get back in their place. If you're just going to let them wander off or you're just going to bark at them, that's not going to help you achieve the standard you want. So think about things you can do around the house, whether it's while you're eating dinner or preparing their dinner or setting them up for failure when people come and knock on the door, or just like the things I've asked you to do to encourage that. Another thing you can do to work on obedience and noise and line manners is holding blind drills. Set up your holding blinds in the parking lot. Put a duck call or a remote release system out in the field, and you can quack duck calls. If you have a training partner, you can get them to shoot a gun off. You can work on getting to the holding blind or leaving the holding blind, getting to the mat, insisting on standards on the mat, that sort of thing. If you've got a noisy dog or a dog that's really undisciplined, can't maintain their composure, I highly recommend Randy Bond's process. It's a book called It's Not the Dog's Fault. He's laid out a very clear and concise step-by-step process to establishing hierarchy in a relationship, obedience that gradually increases the level of difficulty and allows you to develop some tools to get your dog to be more quiet in the field setting. Walking singles. If we want to work on steadiness, and when I mean steadiness, let's talk about that standard for a second. When we get to the mat and I ask you to sit, you must not move forward. You must not stand up. And if the dog isn't maintaining that standard, that's your opportunity to make corrections, have the bird picked up, have the bird rethrown, and demand that standard that you want for steadiness. All right, the next thing that you could work on in terms of fundamentals is bird handling and delivery. I do probably 30 plus workshops a year all over this country, and I can tell you that at least 60% of dogs have bird handling and delivery issues. They're chomping on the bird, they're dropping the bird or putting the bird down and messing around with it on the ground. They're parading around with it. They're grabbing birds off the bird rack. They're jumping up and grabbing birds out of the handler's hands. They're not releasing the bird quickly. And while a lot of you might think that stuff is benign, these are all of the things that lead to freezing on birds. If we nipped every one of those things in the bud, then we wouldn't have a dog that's freezing on birds. We would never have to worry about that. But once we get to that place where we have a dog that freezes on birds, now we've got a real problem that can be almost impossible to deal with. So ask yourself, do I have a dog that has any one of those behaviors that Kevin just mentioned? Maybe that's something I could focus on in some simple training where I'm doing some walking singles in the parking lot, getting the dog to deliver the bird neatly, making corrections where necessary to deal with those standards. The next thing that you could work on is line stuff, reading your dog, communication, delivering information, line mechanics. So we're talking about things that are really important if we're trying to get our dog to understand complex field situations where we're doing big marking tests or complex blind tests. And we need the dog to understand that they need to move a little this way or a little that way, that we need them to think about something over here rather than something over here. And if we don't constantly polish and hone and practice those skills in training, we're simply not going to be very good at it. Meaning we're not going to deliver information very well. Our cadence will be off. The tones that we're using or the commands that we're using, the body language we're using will be off. And our dog will not be as precise as we need them to be. If we can't read precisely where our dog is looking or know what they're thinking because we haven't practiced it a lot, then how can we expect them to do what we want them to do in the field? This is your opportunity to get exceptional at that. Become exceptional at that, and then you're putting the skills and the tools in place to execute advanced training and advanced tests at the field trial or the hunt test. That's how you get to be successful. Some of the drills that I like to do to work on this are the wagon wheel drill. That's a simple pivoting drill that you can use to get your dog to learn to pivot with you, whether you're pulling or pushing. And at the very same time, make sure your focus is on what your dog is doing with their feet when you ask them to pivot. They should not lift their butt off the ground to do this. They should never move forward. They should only move their front feet laterally or scooch their hindquarters laterally. We don't want dogs that creep or stand up to move around to see birds or to be lined up for a blind. When we have dogs that move excessively, now we have creepers and breakers. So this is your opportunity to work on that. The fan drill. A lot of people might not be familiar with the fan drill. It's another drill that we have in the Fetch program. And it really what it is a targeting drill. So the fan, if we go back to the wagon wheel drill, that's primarily a drill that works on pivoting, getting the dog to line their body up in a proper direction. The fan drill is one where we work on targeting. That's getting the dog to line their head and eyes up in the direction that they want them to look. I'm going to do a little bit of drawing here on the board, but essentially it consists of 5 marked piles. They're identified with a stake. Now, you might not be able to get a stake in the ground in the wintertime, so you might come up with something else like a traffic cone or anything that's visible. Or if there's a lot of snow, make sure you have a black stake instead of a white stake. You might have to do a little thinking there on how you're going to set that up. But you've got 5 piles, handler and dog here. Now, these piles are about 4 to 5 yards apart. And you want to start about 10 to 12 yards from the piles. And your goal is just to line to these piles. Practice communication, getting the dog to look at pile number 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 by pushing and pulling. Work on pushing and pulling the head and eyes. As your dog gets good at doing this and you get good at reading where your dog is looking and thinking, what you do is you back up your position a little bit, so that you increase the level of difficulty slightly. You only want to back up a couple of yards at most. And by doing that, now the piles get tighter together, making it more difficult. Eventually, you can back up to 15, 18, maybe even 20 yards, and your communication gets to be very precise. Imagine how that would help you run better cold blinds in the future. So let's talk about another fundamental standard, and that's the standard of stopping. Now, when we're talking about stopping, we're talking about more than just one thing. There are really 5 components to a good stop and sit. The first component is the dog must put on the brakes immediately when they hear the whistle. They must spin around completely. They must plant their butt quickly. They must look at me, and they must wait for the cast. Those are the 5 components that I'm always accessing every time I blow a whistle. Remember what I talked about at the beginning of the webinar, focus. Where does your focus need to be when you're doing any drill? Don't just go through the motions. When you blow a whistle, analyze those 5 components. If the dog doesn't meet the standard of any one of those components, address it in the way that it needs to be addressed. And then what you do is you elevate your standards so that A, your dog puts the brakes on quickly. B, they don't have a big wide loop in their sit. D, they sit there looking at you, waiting patiently, under control. Imagine how that would improve your blind outcomes if you had any one of those problems. You don't need a lot of room to do it. You need a single pile that's about 25 yards from you. Now, there's a lot of steps in there. Again, the Fetch program really goes through all of those steps. What I've learned is that teaching stop and sit in a way that gets you a high quality stop and sit needs a lot of steps in it that are very well thought out, so we don't have a loopy sit. So the dog doesn't misunderstand why they're being corrected. So we're not always dealing with the same substandard problem. Number 5, let's work on marking accuracy. Again, we don't need a lot of room to do some marking work. One of my favorite drills, which I push a lot, is the Y drill. It's one where we have one gunner standing in the field or in the parking lot or the schoolyard, and they're throwing bumpers that are not easy to see. So if you've got snow, preferably you're using white, so they're not that easy to see on the ground. Initially, the gunner throws one mark, sharp angle back. It's run as a single. Of course, we're down here. Then they throw a flat throw in the opposite direction, and then an angle in throw in the same direction as the angle back throw. In this drill, what we're really trying to do is teach the dog to, 1, watch the angle of the throws and be able to detect whether it's an angle in, an angle back, or a flat throw. 2, make sure that they recognize the fall area is very small. It's very easy for a dog, if they can't see the retrieve, to maybe overrun it or hunt around a little bit and then get out of the fall area into another one. And in these situations, I often suggest that the gunner just help the dog so that they get their head up and then they get a little information to get them moving back in the proper direction to find the retrieve. There's definitely some more details here to this drill, but it's a fantastic drill for helping the dog understand that the fall area is a very small area and that they must check in with their surroundings to know where they are relative to where they think the bird is, and also where they should move to if they can't find the bird where they currently are, rather than just run around aimlessly until they find something. All right, walking singles is another great one to work on marking accuracy. If you're going to work on marking accuracy, you certainly don't want to do marks that are 300 yards. You'd like to do marks that are much, much shorter. You want the dog to watch the bird through the complete arc of the throw, to stay focused on the retrieve once it hits the ground rather than swing back to the gun station. You want them to go straight to the retrieve without stopping on the way there and hunting short. You want them to find the mark without running around looking for it. You want them to find it very quickly. What you're doing is you're creating some habits, the habits that you want. This is what, teaches puppies to mark very accurately, because we do the same thing over and over and over again at a very short distance. And if we do that with puppies, that's what you create. There's no reason why it can't help an older dog mark better as well. Walk away retired guns. This is a great one to do to teach the dogs or remind the dogs the mechanics of a retired gun. It's almost a little like an organized confusion drill. Again, we don't need a lot of distance. I don't like to do marks that are any more than 75 yards for this. They could even be shorter, but I want to make sure that I have a couple of bumpers that are teed up. In this case, if you've got snow, you'll want black bumpers, but a couple of bumpers that are teed up, so that one end of one bumper is sticking up in the air where the bumper is going to land that the thrower is going to throw. And you want to make sure that wherever you're going to retire the gunner to is going to be 5 or 6 paces away from where the gunner is going to stand. When that gunner throws the mark, they are then going to walk back to the holding blind. That's going to take them away 5 to 7 paces. A lot of times dogs just look over at the thrower as they're moving and follow them right back to the holding blind. So why would we do this? Well, here's what we're really focusing is on what happens in the next step. It's on that communication where we push the dog a little bit so they swing back over to where the mark had landed. And because there's a target there, we've teed up those two black bumpers. Now the dog is going to lock on the target. And when you send them, they're going to go straight to it. We're essentially teaching them the mechanics of a retired gun and teaching them to run at the mark as opposed to the holding blind that the thrower walked back to. Okay, next area we could work on is casting skills. Just want to check the time here, guys. Casting skills. Again, my scattered bumper drill, it's not my scattered bumper drill, I didn't invent it. And there are other drills that are similar to it, but it is essentially a drill with 7 piles that are staggered in depth. They're only about 20 to 40 yards long. And all I like to work on is a bunch of different things in that drill, but casting skills is one of them. Oftentimes a lot of the advanced training that we do kind of messes up casting skills, believe it or not. And our job is to occasionally go back to those fundamental drills to remind the dogs what the definition of this means. So casting skills like the scattered bumper drill would be one that I would recommend for that. You don't need a lot of room for it. And if you don't have enough room to set up the entire scattered bumper drill, just do part of it. Instead of doing 7 piles, do 5 piles. The next one that I would talk about is disciplined casting. That's the act of handling your dog with a bumper in their mouth. Now, this is a skill that most people forget our dogs need until they actually have to use it. And when do we use it? We use it when a dog is on the return from a water mark and they attempt to run around the water rather than get back in it, or they're swimming back toward us and then just decide to land grab to try and get out of the pond. When that happens, we have to have a tool in our tool bag that allows us to stop the dog and handle them when they have a bumper in their mouth. And just because a dog will do it when they don't have a bumper in their mouth doesn't mean they're going to handle at all well when they have a bumper in their mouth. This is something we have to practice on a regular basis. And by the way, when spring comes and we're about to get back in the water and do a swim by review, they're going to have to do discipline casting there. So why not brush them up on that skill to make sure that they will stop on a whistle when they have a bumper in their mouth, that they will take an over and angle back when you ask them to do it when they have a bumper in their mouth. Another area that I think we could work on here is initial lines. One of my favorite drills, which I discovered from a gentleman named Rob from California, was the California drill. He didn't call it the California drill. I called it the California drill because he was from California. The California is a great drill for getting better initial lines. He came to a 7-day spring training camp that I had last year, and I was fascinated by how well his dogs would work with him online to pick out a target or to look in a specific direction, and how well that dog would line when he would send it. And I said to him, Rob, what do you do? And he said, I do this drill. I just kind of invented it myself. And he described it to me. And essentially what you do is you set up several blinds. They do not have to be long. They could be 30 yards, 40 yards, 50 yards. If you've got 70 yards, you can throw 70 yards in there. But they don't have to be long. And they're going to be multiple blinds with a little bit of space between them. You don't want them real tight, but they don't have to be too far apart either. And what you're going to do is you're going to mark all of these blinds with a stake or a traffic cone if necessary. And make sure it's a stake that your dog can see. So if you're training in the snow, it should be a black stake or a traffic cone that stands out. And then what you're going to do is you're going to add a whole lot of elements into these blinds that often distract the dog, make it difficult to get good initial lines. That could be decoys, that could be holding blinds, that could be a winger, that could be a person sitting in the field, that could be a little log jump or something that your dogs would have to go over. Just whatever you can think of that might be a distraction for your dog or an obstacle for your dog. And because you have white stakes out there, it's going to be much easier for your dog, to pick out the target of the destination and to talk them into the line that you want them to take. Once you've run all of the blinds, you could have 5, you could have 7. What you're going to do is you're going to go out in the field immediately after you get done and remove all of the markers. Then you're going to get your dog back out and you're going to rerun those blinds. It's going to be much easier to get those initial lines once your dog has already done it once. And I've coached my fetch students on this drill all throughout the summer this year, and it's incredible the amount of progress they've made with respect to their initial lines. So I strongly encourage that one. For those of you that are running hunt test walk-ups, the mechanics of a walk-up, you could be practicing that. You could be insisting on obedience standards. You don't need a big setup. You need one mark out in the parking lot or the schoolyard, or maybe 2, because you could practice 2 walk-ups that are relatively short. And where does your focus need to be? It doesn't need to be on the bird when it's thrown. It needs to be on your dog. What are they doing? And do it in a drill-like format. Don't just start blowing duck calls and shooting guns and all that stuff right off the bat. Maybe start with just a silent throw or one little quack in a throw so that your dog potentially can meet the standard for obedience. Or maybe you do get a correction in, but it won't be so exciting that even with a correction, your dog still can't compose themselves. And then gradually increase the level of excitement. Remote sends. Again, for those of you running hunt tests, oftentimes your dog has to run from a platform or position away from you. You don't need a big test out in the field, just some short marks in the parking lot again, where you could practice this skill. Your focus, again, doesn't need to be out on the marks as they're throwing. Let somebody behind you watch the marks and say, okay, everything's good, or there's a no bird out there, but you know where they are. They always fall in the same place. You need to focus on your dog's behavior. What are they doing? Are they creeping forward? Are they standing up? Did they break? Make sure you address those situations accordingly. And for those of you running field trials, think about remote send blinds. That's not a common thing we see in field trials, but it does happen occasionally where you have to sit your dog in a remote position and then step back to the running mat and handle your dog out to a blind from their starting position. This would just be a great place to set up a drill to do that, like a 3-peat. Which brings me to my next one, which is blind concepts. Blind concepts like poison birds, or just a person sitting in the field, or dry pop, or a holding blind out in the field. 3-peats, which essentially what you want to do is you plan 3 blinds. Again, they don't have to be long. You're trying to create a drill-like scenario. By shortening everything up, you make the communication much easier to understand that you're going to impart to your dog. So we have 3 blinds that intersect in a single place. We have a running mat here, a running mat here, and a running mat here. And this would be blind 1, this would be blind 2, this would be blind 3. What we do in these situations is we decide on what concept we want to work on, what diversion. It could be that maybe we have just a person sitting over here. Maybe the person fires a dry pop. Maybe they throw a bird. Maybe it's just a holding blind out there. But your dog is going to hear the dry pop and run a blind. Come back, move to the next mat, hear the dry pop, run a blind. Move over to the next mat, hear the dry pop, run the blind. And by doing that, what you're doing is you're giving the dog 3 opportunities to experience the same concept in a drill-like environment and help them understand the communication that we would use when these types of things happen. You are working on line mechanics when these types of things happen. Because you're getting multiple reps in, you're giving the dog more opportunities to connect the dots to understand what all of this stuff means. For those of you in hunt test, bucket work or following the gun, we don't need much room. We could even do that in our backyard if we've got room to do that. Get your bucket out, get your broomstick out, and have a couple wingers out there in the backyard if you've got them. fire one off and then swing the gun around to the next one. You can say commands like here if you need to, but you're down at your dog's level. When you're down at your dog's level, they see these movements. They learn to move with your body and with the gun. This is just a great time to practice that. Remember, when you're doing this stuff, you got to think about reps too, over and over and over again. Not just doing it once is what creates habits. The habits we want, we need to do it over and over and over again. So plan that into your 2-week training plan as you go through the winter. We're getting close to the end here, folks, so bear with me. I know we've been going for a while. Sometimes dogs have a problem with switching. We might have a marking situation. You may have seen it over the course of the summer where you've seen your dog hunt one fall area, and then before they find it, they go over to another fall area and begin to hunt a different fall area. Unfortunately, that is an eliminating fault. Dogs will be eliminated from competition if that happens, or if we don't get a handle in quickly enough. So we can do things like the dirt clod drill. That is a drill where you throw what looks like a bird or a bumper, but it's actually just maybe it was a chunk of dirt or a chunk of firewood or a snowball or something like that. The dog sees something flying through the air, but when they go out to retrieve it, there's actually nothing there to retrieve. So they start to hunt and hunt and hunt. And eventually they may decide to leave the area. And when they leave the area, the thrower should throw another real bird or bumper to where the chunk of wood landed. And hopefully the dog will not see it when this happens. And then as soon as the bumper is out there, then the gunner can help the dog by hollering at the dog and maybe making an arm swing and some motion toward the retrieve to get the dog moving back toward the fall area and to begin the hunt again. And of course, they're going to find it now because it's there. And what we're doing is we're teaching the dog to persist in their hunt. So if you've got a dog that's had a history of switching, this would be a great thing to do. And again, you don't need a ton of room for this. If you can get a 50-yard mark in, you could probably set something up like this. And if we've got a little extra room here, I'd also suggest some ABCD drills or tight marking scenarios. ABCD drills are not long. We don't need a lot of distance. So if we can set some marks up that are really tight, we can get our dogs to be more comfortable in these tight marking situations and perhaps a little more organized in their hunt. I want to thank you guys for joining me tonight. It's been a pleasure sharing with you, guiding you tonight, because that's what I love to do, is guide people. If you think you want more information like this, I certainly have a lot of free resources on my website. There's a free resources tab. There's a blog there where I have a lot of training articles that you could read up on various things. And if you think you'd like to become a member of the Fetch program, where you have access to me to ask questions, where you can access all of the information to run these drills, where I tell you what you need to focus on, how to do it, what to do when things happen, so you're not like, oh my God, that just happened, what do I do? So there's diagrams there to help you. Think about joining the Fetch program. We're opening up in March. I also do in-person workshops. Think about hitting one of those up as well. Again, thank you for joining me tonight. It's been a pleasure. Happy training, everyone.